Okay, how is everyone tonight?
Good, Professor. How are you?
I'm doing okay, thank you. Any questions about anything?
Nothing major.
That's good. Okay. Let's see. I've been thinking more about the town assignment. Has anyone done any more work on the town assignment since Monday?
I have. I've been trying to find people to contact.
Oh, really? How's it going? Is it
Slowly.
really?
I just decided to email the reference librarian at the town library to see if they can help me because I'm going home this weekend
Okay.
anyway, so
Well, good. Did you hear anything?
I haven't heard back yet.
Okay. Well, these are all the things you learn doing research, so it's good. Anyone else have any leads, dead ends, which is all part of the process? Okay. Let me see. Okay. So thematically, Where did we leave off in terms of what's happening with the revolution?
I think you said we were going to talk about winter at Valley Forge, that, but you had just mentioned it briefly last time.
Okay. And so you do want to talk about that. It's not like I said I was going to talk about that, and you said, oh, good, you forgot. We don't have to hear that saga again. Actually, good. I'm glad you asked. So you have this winter that the British spend in the relative comfort of Philadelphia. And remember, there were a lot of loyalists in Philadelphia and people who now saw an advantage in being reunited with the British Empire and having the British Army occupying. And also, there are a lot of Quakers in Philadelphia who don't like fighting, as you probably know. And so you have this kind of interesting dichotomy between General Gage and his force, or General Howe and his forces in Philadelphia, and then Washington's army in Valley Forge, which is a valley north and west of Philadelphia. You know, not that far actually, as the geographically. And the winter at Valley Forge is one of these extraordinary set pieces that turns into it is a very important part of the national story or the national folklore. Washington occupied a stone house. His officers built wooden cabins, and many of the men were in tents. And one of the big problems, of course, for Washington's army was the problem of supply. How do you supply these forces? And there had been extraordinary problems with the whole quartermaster's department. I'm not going to belabor you with a description of how the quartermasters worked in acquiring supplies for this, pretty significant group of people, men. They need flour to make bread, which was one of the main things they would eat. Also, salted beef or pork, anything they could get. And these are hard to come by. And of course, if you are someone who raises these things or deals in these things, here is a group that needs to buy them. So the prices are going to go up. And you have all kinds of difficulty here. And if you're a farmer in Pennsylvania, you can bring your goods to Philadelphia where there is a British army that can pay good hard currency, or you could possibly bring them to this group at Valley Forge that is going to pay you in something worthless, like the paper money being issued. So you see a lot of farmers actually preferring to do business with the British as opposed to the American. The Continental Congress, by the way, in 1777 had begun issuing paper money, a continental dollar. And this is one of the first forms of independence. We're not going to peg our currency on the British pound, but on the Spanish dollar, the gold dollar minted in Mexico, or silver minted in Peru, or the silver mined in Peru and then minted in Spain. And the Americans choose to go with the dollar as opposed to the pound. Each colony has its own currency. Some used the dollar, some used the pound, and they fluctuated wildly in value. And so the Congress decides to peg things to the dollar, create the dollar. But the problem for the United States, of course, and here Ainsley had wanted to talk about Valley Forge, and suddenly I'm talking about currency and gold, silver versus paper money. Congress had decided to print paper money, but the problem, of course, is the United States does not have any reserves of gold or silver. So legally, the continental dollar is pegged to the Spanish dollar, but because we don't have any hard currency, you can keep printing more paper money. And paper money does, it's an inflationary thing. Inflation, I know some of you are economists and I am really not, so I don't want to mislead you by giving you misleading information on how currency fluctuates. By 1779, 1780, the paper money issued by Congress was pretty much worthless. In fact, there becomes a phrase, not worth a continental. That is, something is not worth the continental dollar. So this is part of the overall problem of supply. Um, Washington does turn the quartermaster's department over to General Nathaniel Greene. Greene, from Rhode Island Quaker, grew up working in an iron foundry, is very good at figuring out where to get supplies, how to pay for them, and so on, actually cleaning up the lines of supply. So the Army doesn't starve completely at Valley Forge, but they don't have a lot to eat. And they also don't have a ready supply of leather for shoes or clothing or other things. So by the middle of the winter, the men who remain with Washington's army are pretty destitute. They are barefoot in many cases and have little to eat. And it's one of these experiences which makes us wonder about who these guys were and what makes them stay with this army when it seems so hopeless. Now, on the other hand, the winter at Valley Forge, it may be because of this shared suffering that it does have a tremendous effect on the army overall. So the army that marches into camp at Valley Forge for the winter of 1777-78 is much different from the army that is going to march out in the early summer of 1778. This winter does give them an experience of sharing this suffering, but also it's an opportunity to train. And fortuitously, there had arrived in the camp yet another of these foreign characters, and this was the Baron Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben. One thing you should note is that Americans tend to simplify the pronunciation of foreign names. And the Baron von Steuben presented himself as coming from the army of Frederick the Great. And Frederick the Great, generally regarded as one of the greatest monarchs of the era, as well as one of the greatest warriors of the era. And so here is a guy who has served under Frederick the Great. It turns out that Baron Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben never actually had served under Frederick the Great in battle. He had been part of King Frederick the Great's household staff, which is still more than any of us have done. And the von wasn't actually an honorific given to him by Frederick the Great. Instead, it was given to him by a minor German principality. Again, I don't know if any of us has been recognized by any major or minor European principality, but von Steuben had. And one thing he really understands is how to train soldiers. And so you think about it, Washington has this German fellow arrive and wants something to do. And he suggests to Washington that how about if every week you give me 100 men to train? And we'll see how it goes. You know, this is kind of a test. If the first week is a disaster, then you could simply tell this helpful German fellow, thank you, but you know, we think we'll find a better use for you somewhere else. But he is very good at training men in things they don't really know how to do, but which are really very important if you are a soldier, which is, for example, marching and learning to know your left from your right so that everyone is stepping in unison. Because one thing you want to do in any kind of a disciplined military force is have this kind of cohesion. And so training the men in marching and in other kinds of tactics, in small arms tactics. And so every week he has 100 men to train, and then another 100 and so on. And then these men also can train other men. And by the way, doing this kind of training is also a great relief from the boredom that is going to set in. If we're just sitting in camp, we have nothing to do. And it's going to be a bad situation. You have a couple of thousand guys just sitting around with time on their hands, nothing to do except to complain about how hungry they are. The training does give them something to do. And he is very good at training them. Also, he comes to understand more about this American army. He comes from a German army, and in the German army, any European army, you give an order and the men obey it. That is, this is something that inherently people do. Europe has a class structure, and the officers always are people from the upper echelons of the society. The soldiers are always from the lower echelons of society. But that's not the case here. Now, by this time, many of the men in this army are not from the upper echelons of society. One reason some of these guys are here is because they have no other options, no other place to go. And so here they are. And so he is training people and giving them a place in this army, but he also recognizes that you give a German soldier or a French soldier or an English soldier an order, he will automatically do it. The consequences are he could be shot for disobedience of orders. An American soldier will always want to know why he has to do something. And this, to many of the European officers who came over, the French officers primarily, was simply unheard of and something they couldn't really understand. You give an order and they will want to know, well, why should we do that? And initially, this is something he sees as a problem, but then he comes to see that this is actually something else. He explained this to a colleague. That you have to explain to them the reason you are giving them an order to do something. And he says, once you have explained the rationale, he said, you're not going to find better soldiers. But they do want to know why you're giving them an order to do something. It is this questioning of authority that he sees as inherent in the character of these people, which makes them much different from the European armies he has been in. And it also gives him something really to work with as he is training these soldiers into becoming an army. Now, while all of this is happening, Congress is also thinking about the nature of the war. And it would be enough to say, okay, so Washington had this winter at Valley Forge to train the army, but also Congress is wondering how come they are no longer in Philadelphia. And they think the reason they are no longer in Philadelphia is because Washington really was inept. Washington had allowed the British to take Philadelphia. And Congress knows that Horatio Gates had actually defeated the British up at Saratoga. And so Congress creates a board to oversee the war, chaired by Horatio Gates, who now becomes Washington's superior in administering the war. Washington and Gates didn't really have a close relationship, and Congress, putting Gates over Washington is actually a step short of what a lot of the members of Congress, including most of the New Englanders, wanted to do, which was simply to replace Washington with Gates altogether. Get rid of Washington. He's proved his ineptitude. Let's replace him with General Gates, who actually has shown that he can win something. And I think if we were going to take a vote here, we're Congress. We've been expelled from Philadelphia by the British Army. Here is another general who managed to defeat the British Army. Well, shouldn't we replace the one who has shown his ineptitude with one who's shown he can win? And I see a show of hands. Who here is for sacking Washington, replacing him with Gates? No one wants to raise their hands and say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I think, maybe you've read to the end of the book and so you know how this comes out. But, you can see why there is going to be a move in Congress to get rid of Washington. And Washington, though, is savvy enough a player to have enough friends in Congress to prevent that. But another thing he does not have the political juice to prevent is Congress thinking of why not have another invasion of Canada? And now they think we have the perfect officer to have to invade Canada, and that's Lafayette. Who better to invade Canada this time than this dashing French officer? And so Congress does tell Washington to have Lafayette mount an expedition into Canada, which reluctantly Washington does. Lafayette comes to see, Lafayette at first, he's not even 20 years old yet. And here Congress is putting him in charge of an invasion of Canada. And so, of course, that would flatter anyone's vanity. If I said, for example, to Jake, okay, we're going to put you in charge of an army to conquer Canada, I think that's a great opportunity. But then Lafayette comes to see that this is Congress recognized that Lafayette is by this time become one of Washington's biggest allies. And if we send him off to Canada, he'll be out of the way. And meanwhile, there is yet another French officer, General Thomas Conway. He's French, although he's actually initially Irish, but he had served in the French army. And he is lobbying to get rid of Washington. And he is dealing with a number of other junior officers as well as members of Congress and what comes to be called the Conway Cabal. That is this group trying to replace Washington with Gates or someone else. Now, fighting the British is in many ways the least of the problems Washington has during this winter. It's actually fighting with the weather, hunger, and with the scheming of Washington's political adversaries. That is really the biggest challenge during this winter of 1777 and 78. Meanwhile, actually, General Greene refers to the whole Canadian invasion as a Don Quixote expedition to the northward. That is, we've already tried to invade Canada once and a half, and it hasn't worked. And now another attempt is going to be probably just as difficult. It's not the last time, by the way, the United States will mount an invasion of Canada. So you have these problems for Washington and his army. Meanwhile, all isn't smooth sailing for the British in Philadelphia. As I think I mentioned, having the comfort of Philadelphia is a good thing, and this really would be a good opportunity for the British to show how well governed a city will be when it is under their control. And this, of course, will encourage people in other American towns to say, you know, maybe the British weren't quite so bad. And in many ways, you know, I think if I had a choice, I'd probably rather spend that winter in Philadelphia than at Valley Forge. And it would be a good thing for all of us to think about, where would you rather be? And things are pretty good for the British. Of a couple of big problems they have, though. One is at about the same time, the British government had sent over a commission, 3 commissioners, to try to get the Americans to come back to their senses and rejoin the empire. The Parliament had rescinded the Declaratory Act, and Parliament was going to lighten up on taxing the Americans. That is, these 2 big grievances the Americans had. Parliament said, okay, we're not going to do that after all. So why don't you let's let bygones be bygones. And they get here and they find a big problem in that the British generals in Philadelphia don't think this is going to work. And also there is a problem among the generals about who is in charge. The Howes are still the General William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe are the highest ranking military figures here, but General Howe has been recalled and is going to be replaced by General Clinton. And Clinton and Howe really hate each other. And by most accounts, most people don't like General Clinton. He has kind of a difficult personality. Well, who am I to talk about someone with a difficult personality? He is a very serious officer. He writes a great memoir about the war. And the one lesson you get from this is if only everyone had listened to General Clinton, the war would have turned out much differently. He also sees the Howes and Burgoyne and these other officers get promoted because of their political influence and not because of their skill. And I think he has a legitimate grievance there. And he arrives in May of 78 with new orders that at the end of this winter, the British have spent in Philadelphia, the British government has decided, let's not stay in Philadelphia anymore. That is, in England, there's kind of a feeling that you have this big army you've sent there to win back the Americans, and all they have done is sit in the biggest, most comfortable city in America. They haven't really done any much to win back the Americans by sitting around in Philadelphia. And so they want Clinton, okay, go take command of the army that's in Philadelphia, but we don't want you to stay in Philadelphia. What we want you to do is protect the British holdings in the Caribbean and protect Florida, which is really critical to protecting the British holdings in the Caribbean. I should say one of Clinton's earlier ideas had been, why don't we just pull all of the British forces to Florida and to Canada? We'll just give up here entirely, but not giving up completely, because he thought what was going to happen is the Americans would simply fight among themselves. And after 5-10 years of just killing each other, they would get tired of that. And they would ask the British to come back so that they could prevent the Americans from killing each other, which is what he thought inevitably they were going to do. These are people who really can't get along with each other, and they need some force to kind of hold them in line, to keep Americans from cutting each other's throats, which Clinton had thought was kind of a natural tendency among these folks. Remember, his father had been governor of New York in the 1740s. He had spent about 10 years there, so he had some experience with Americans. So Clinton is told, go take command of the army. Howe is coming back to England, and you're evacuating Philadelphia. This causes a great consternation among the loyal people in Philadelphia who've been living happily under British occupation, because now they know the army is going to leave, and they really are going to have to face the wrath of the Americans who thought, no, you're a bunch of traitors. And also, if you do happen to own property in Philadelphia and you have been loyal, you're someone like Joseph Galloway, who had been in charge of things, you have to leave, and you're not going to get to keep any of your property. This is really a bad thing. So you have this difficult moment for the British, which would seem to be a moment of relative victory, since they've occupied Philadelphia. Washington's army is kind of holed up in this desolate area northwest of them, but now they're leaving Philadelphia because of orders they've gotten from home. Now, the officers who have served under the Howes don't want to let them leave without the officers showing how much the officers appreciate having had the opportunity to serve under the Howes. Now, if you've ever been in a situation like this, one boss is being replaced by another, and the one who's leaving is the one you really liked, and the new one is someone everyone knows is really a stiff. You would want to celebrate the old folk, the leaving people too. So they have, this is one of the most extraordinary public events ever in the history of the country. It's a Meschianza, Meschiaienza, which is a big festival to celebrate the Howes. And it involves fireworks, a parade, and it's not just a parade. In the parade, the British officers dress as medieval knights. And after the parade, they have a jousting contest. And the young belles of Philadelphia, that is, young ladies of Philadelphia, come as medieval princesses who will bestow a ribbon on their favored knight. Remember, these knights are British officers. And you could think, if you are someone who is one of these belles of Philadelphia, this might not look so good when Washington's bedraggled army comes back and you've been bestowing your ribbons on the departing British officers, but it doesn't look like Washington's army is going to be able to do much. And these young women dressed as princesses, they wear complete Turkish outfits, including turbans. And I don't know if anyone has ever seen an elaborate medieval Turkish outfit. Has anyone I don't know, Halloween is coming up, so I don't know if anyone's thinking.
Yeah,
You have? Oh,
yeah.
Tariq has. Okay. So can you tell us more, Tariq, about?
In terms of medieval, do you mean Ottoman age
Yes, the
or
Ottoman age. Yes, exactly.
so in terms of soldiers or
Well, both.
citizens?
Yeah, soldiers and princesses.
So it was actually really cool. They had these iron from head to toe suits. They were usually four pieces. They didn't really wear chainmail from the front like European knights did. They only wore them from under the armor, and the actual armor from the outside would all be one piece.
Wow. Wow.
Considered them to be art.
Yeah.
A lot of gold was put into it too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So imagine this. Imagine this is an army that's preparing to leave, but before they do, they're creating these costumes for this festival. And they're also going to have a jousting contest, which, if my understanding is correct, involves two guys on horses riding toward each other with spears to try to knock the other one off of his horse. And of course, in the Ottoman era, when there would have been warriors doing this, the victorious guy would then cut off the head of the guy whom he knocked off the horse. The British soldiers aren't going to do this, but you can get the picture of this. And they have, barges on the Delaware River setting off fireworks, playing music. And then also these young women dressed as Turkish princesses don't just walk to the jousting, they are carried on palanquins. And these are chairs that are carried by African Americans who are slaves who wear turbans. So they are dressed also as Ottoman slaves. And it's part of this entire festival the British are putting on here. And it costs a lot to do all of this. And General Clinton doesn't think it's that good a thing, A, because it's really a distraction, and B, it's celebrating the guys he is replacing, and he's replacing them, he thinks, because they are incompetent. And then also you have the fact that, well, how do the people who are not mourning the departure of the house going to take all of this? Isn't this an extravagant waste of money and time to be doing this? I mean, I'm all for festivals and celebrations like this. No, I'm not advocating that we have a Meshianza. If one of you wants to propose it, you're welcome to, and see how. As President Kelly, we would like to give you a Meshianza as a way of celebrating. Yeah, you can see that this is might cause some questioning. And as all of this is happening, these three commissioners arrive from England, and they are really stunned. They arrive here, and in the midst of preparing the Meshianza, is also evacuating Philadelphia. It's the first they had heard of evacuating Philadelphia. And they go to General Clinton, and they say, well, we want to go talk to the members of Congress. And he says, no, I can't give you permission to go talk to the members of Congress. And so Clinton is saying, didn't you get the memo? They're actually the enemy. And so, no, I'm not going to send you to talk to the members of Congress. So then they actually ask Washington. They contact Washington to get Washington to give them permission to talk to Congress. And Washington says, I'll forward your request to Congress, but that's it. By the way, Washington had a long-running problem with British agents contacting him. That is, during the siege of Boston, whenever General Howe sent him a message, he would address it simply to Colonel Washington, because Washington's highest position under the British Army had been a colonel, and Washington would never respond. Or if he got something addressed to Mr. Washington. Howe and Gage and the British Army don't want to acknowledge that Washington is a general, because in his mind, their mind, he is not. He was given this commission by Congress, and Congress doesn't have the authority to create generals. The king can create generals, but not a body like Congress. And so when the British will not acknowledge that Washington's a general, he won't acknowledge that they've actually contacted him. And you can think, boy, what a stuck-up guy Washington is. He wants everyone to call him general. But his point isn't that they are disrespecting me, General Washington. They are disrespecting the Congress and the people who have chosen the Congress. That is, he says, my commission comes from the choice of a free people. So the commissioners are able to get a message to Washington, and Washington forwards their message to Congress, but nothing more happens with that episode. Now, back in Philadelphia, Howe and the departing British have kind of a major problem. That is, they have about 11,000 men that they have to get from Philadelphia to New York. And they have a lot of boats to take these men to New York. But the problem is now they have about 11,000 loyalists who say, you have to take us too. You can't leave us here. And after all we have done for you, it's really a dilemma for the Howes and for Clinton what to do with all these loyalists. And the loyalists in Philadelphia, I have to say, are smart enough, pretty smart. They weren't smart enough to make the right choice. Well, it would have looked like the right choice when the British came into Philadelphia and Washington's army was off at Valley Forge. The right choice would seem to be side with the British now. But now the British are leaving. And so now they make the very wise choice of going to plead their cause, not to General Clinton, the guy whose whole focus is military necessity, but instead they're going to go talk to the Howes. They've just had this big festival for them. Everyone loves the Howes, and the Howes are, of course, really nice guys. I'm waxing nostalgic about the Howes myself as I'm telling you how wonderful the Howes are. By the way, the Howes are going to go back to England and going to face an inquiry by the Parliament. One thing you can always count on, when things go badly in a war, you are going in a war created, which is being fought by a country that has a legislative body, like Parliament. You're going to see an inquiry into why things went wrong. And what is going to happen in Parliament when the Howes get back is Parliament is going to launch an inquiry into why things went badly. And of course, the inquiry is going to focus on the Howe brothers since they have been in charge. The Howe brothers are pretty savvy politicians, and they say it was not our fault. It was actually the fault of the Ministry of War, which was giving us orders. And so you're going to see over the next 3 years a big fight in Parliament over who is responsible for this debacle. Is it the Howes or is it the Minister of War? And you can make an argument on either side. By the way, the British Minister of Marine, the Lord of the Admiralty, the Earl of Sandwich. He is in charge of the British Navy, and Britain has the biggest and best Navy in the world. And that may make you wonder how come the Navy could not win this particular war. And I think partly it is because the Earl of Sandwich was extraordinarily incompetent. You usually don't get to be the Lord of Admiralty in England by your competence at managing the sea. In fact, there's a famous 19th century song about a British Lord of the Admiralty. Is anyone familiar with Gilbert and Sullivan's The Monarch of the Sea, the ruler of the Queen's Navy? And how do you get to be the monarch of the sea? There's a wonderful song he sings about, when I was a lad, I served a term as office boy to an attorney's firm. I cleaned the windows and I swept the floor and I polished up the handle of the big front door. I polished up the handle so carefully that now I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy. And he goes on, he rises through the ranks. He gets elected to Parliament. He's elected to Parliament because he becomes very rich as a lawyer. And then he always voted at his party's call and never thought of thinking for himself at all. And he said, I thought so little they rewarded me by making me the ruler of the Queen's Navy. It's in fact, it was modeled on a real person, and he got really annoyed when he came to an event and they would strike up this song thinking it was in his honor. But the Earl of Sandwich had also become Lord of the Admiralty through a similar process. And in fact, he was often bored with, I believe this is the same Earl of Sandwich for whom the piece of meat between two slices of bread is named, because he didn't want to take away the time he spent playing cards by having a dinner. So a sandwich he could eat while he was playing cards, and often he would have most of the real responsibilities in the office managed by his mistress, who also occupied the Admiralty. And I'm not saying that she was incompetent, but perhaps if you had a choice between the Earl of Sandwich and his mistress, she might have been the better party in this. At any rate, I'm getting off the subject here, just talking to you about ancient British politics. And here, the loyalists in Philadelphia go to the House and they say, you've got to help us, because we know when the rebels come back, it's going to be really bad for us. And so Howe promises them all space on this British fleet that's going to be leaving Philadelphia to go back to New York. And when Clinton finds out he doesn't have room on this fleet for the 11,000 soldiers he's bringing back to New York, because the fleet's now occupied not only by the loyalists to Philadelphia, but by all their property, Clinton has to figure out a different way to get his troops back to New York. And it seems like there's actually only one way to do that, and that is to march them across New Jersey. And so the loyalists and the Howes are placed aboard the fleet and all of the baggage of the loyalists. And then Clinton has to figure out the not insignificant problem of getting this army across New Jersey. And this is now, it's June of 1778. And summers in New Jersey are hot and humid, and these men are carrying a lot of baggage, or bringing a lot of baggage with them. And it's going to be a long line. Imagine how long 11,000 men are going to be, along with all of their baggage. And so what Clinton does is have a kind of a wagon train in front with baggage, a wagon train behind, because he doesn't want his line to be too extended, because that would be really bad. Because he knows one thing Washington's army is really good at is attacking weak points of any kind of a long line. Remember, by this time, the British have had long experience with Americans attacking them in New Jersey with great success. And Clinton wants to avoid something like that happening again. Now, there are a couple of big things here in terms of this British retreat across New Jersey that are worth talking about. One is, this is just 2 years after the British and the Germans had marched across New Jersey, chasing Washington and his army. And then they had been welcomed by the people of New Jersey, who wanted to show their loyalty. Now, 2 years later, what really strikes the British and their German allies as they're marching across New Jersey is the place looks deserted. No one is coming out to greet them. In fact, people are hiding. People have gotten all of their livestock out of sight. And it's like they're going through this abandoned place, this abandoned territory. And you also have, well, I misspoke. You also have Washington and his army thinking about attacking. I should say, I misspoke when I explained Clinton putting his baggage in the front and the back. He knew, and any of you with a military thinking would have thought, well, that was stupid, because then the baggage is unprotected. He actually has the baggage in the middle. 12 miles of a baggage train. And I hope you can picture how long 12 miles is. You know, that's about from Boston to Quincy. Yeah, that much is the baggage train. And then you have about that length in front and behind of British and German soldiers. And this way the army can protect the baggage train, which they really want to get to New York. And they're taking it to New Brunswick on the eastern part of New Jersey, where it can then be put onto boats and taken to New York, which is going to remain their headquarters. So you have these two long, slow armies separated by this baggage train going through this desolated area. And you have the other thing is a big discussion going on among Washington's officers about what we should do when we have the opportunity now to attack the English or the British Army in New Jersey. By this time, Charles Lee has come back on the scene. He had been the second in command. He was captured just before Trenton when he thought everything was going badly. And he now is back with Washington's army. A British officer who had been captured, he was exchanged actually for Burgoyne. And so now this turns out to be bad news for Washington because now Lee is back. And Lee always thinks he knows better than everyone else. And Lee's advice is, if the British are leaving Philadelphia, he says, we should build them a bridge of gold to help them get out of Philadelphia because it's such a rich thing for us to get back to Philadelphia. Now, by this time, Washington's other officers, including Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, and Alexander Hamilton, say, we really should attack. This would be the great moment to attack them. Lee says, no, we absolutely should not attack the British Army as it's going through New Jersey. The other officers say, yes, we should. And what Washington does is send some men to harass the British as they are retreating. And other than that, let them get almost all the way across New Jersey. Alexander Hamilton says this plan of simply attacking the rear of the retreating army would have done honor to the most honorable body of midwives and them. He doesn't think this is really a good way of fighting the war. That would be a good line, wouldn't it? If anyone wants to write a musical about Hamilton, doing honor to a great body of midwives would be one. Okay, now the British Army the front of it gets to Sandy Hook, which is, I'm assuming that everyone carries in their head a map of the geography of New Jersey, and you know where Sandy Hook is. And has anyone been to Sandy Hook? From the name, can anyone imagine what Sandy Hook might be like?
Sandy.
It is sandy, yes. Anything else? It's like a hook, and it extends north. It's kind of as a barrier to the New Jersey Meadowlands and New Brunswick, and you can put men aboard boats there to get them to New York if they're not in New Brunswick, which is actually a pretty significant town. And so they get the forward part of the army, and the baggage is at Sandy Hook. And meanwhile, the rest of the army, you can't get everyone to Sandy Hook. So a few miles inland in Monmouth County, actually the Monmouth County Courthouse, and it's now actually the town of Freehold, you have Lord Cornwallis with the rear of the army waiting until the guys in front and the baggage get onto their boats, go over to New York, then he'll take his men to Sandy Hook, get them over to New York, and thus out of New Jersey. Does anyone know anything significant about the town of Freehold in New Jersey? Since we're having kind of a musical theme here, I recited rather than sang you the Gilbert and Sullivan, home of a well-known American musician. Mrs. Allison is raising her hand in another part of the household. He made his first album, actually, called Greetings from Asbury Park, another nude place on the New Jersey shore. Wow. Is this making you feel old, Mrs. Allison?
Wait, Bruce Springsteen?
Yes, Bruce Springsteen.
Oh,
Okay,
right.
thank you, James. Thank you. Okay. Ask your grandparents. Okay, well, So there they are at Freehold, well known at one time as the hometown of Bruce Springsteen, known to us now for what is about to transpire. And this is an area, the southern part of New Jersey is sandy with kind of scrub pines, hence much of southern New Jersey is an area called the Pine Barrens. And you can imagine, I hope, how this is not going to be a good place to be on a hot, humid day in June. And the British Army, wearing their wool uniforms, is there waiting in this area, which is also kind of a bowl. And Washington and his army now are approaching. And Washington and his officers decide they will attack. And the officer who had been most against attacking, Charles Lee, now insists that Washington allow him to lead the charge. Now, all of the other officers who had said, yeah, we should attack, they've been saying we should attack for about a month, are really kind of miffed, because now Charles Lee is the one who gets to lead the attack. And Lee does lead the attack. And it's probably a reason Lee had not wanted to attack the British, is because when he finally does attack, he proves to be a complete incompetent at attacking. Not that I've ever attacked another army, so maybe I shouldn't criticize. It is my job as an historian to criticize everyone else who's doing things I could never do. So when the attack, the British actually are pretty good soldiers. Cornwallis mounts a counterattack and Lee begins to retreat. Washington comes on the scene just as Lee and his men are retreating, and he asks Lee what you're doing, and Lee says, well, we're retreating. And Washington says something to the effect of, you damned poltroon, get out of the way, and dismisses Lee, rather peremptory. By the way, Washington, as I think I mentioned, had a hot temper. And this is one of the cases where he loses his temper with Lee, and then Washington rallies the troops, and they go on to keep fighting for the rest of the day. In fact, the image you see behind me is a 19th century image of one of the episodes in this battle when the gunner, the American man tending the cannon, was shot. And there were a lot of women with the American army, often the wives of soldiers, and this is one. And she was known as Moll Pitcher. That is, Molly was I'm looking quickly to see if anyone in the class is named Molly. It used to be a fairly common woman's name. And she would be the one carrying a pitcher of water. And this is a sweltering day for these guys who are fighting. In fact, many of the casualties are from heat stroke during this battle. Her husband, who had been tending the gun, is shot, so she takes his place at the gun and becomes one of the heroes of the Battle of Monmouth, or Freehold. And Washington organizes his forces. They're able to hold their ground, but ultimately his men do retreat. But by this time, the British forces are worn out. Something like they've lost about 360 men, the British have, in Clinton's forces. The Americans lost about 200, and the British killed, wounded, dead of heat stroke. Heat stroke was the big killer on the day of the Battle of Monmouth, and both armies are exhausted by the end of it. And it's not a victory for either side, but Washington sees and the British sees that this army fights much better than it had before the winter at Valley Forge. So the Battle of Monmouth is the last major engagement in the North, and it's not a victory. In fact, you can look at most of the battles Washington fought, and you'll see one consistency is it's not a victory, but it's also not a defeat. And that is something Washington is coming to see, that the point isn't that we are going to beat the British Army. The point is we are not going to be beaten by the British Army. Is winning the war while losing every battle. And this you can see at Monmouth. Each side is exhausted. The Americans pull off. Cornwallis gets his men finally aboard the ships and into New York. And a week later, the French fleet arrives. imagine if the French fleet had arrived while Cornwallis was trying to get, either Cornwallis was trying to get his men across from Sandy Hook to New York, or while Howe's fleet was going from Philadelphia to New York. Had the French fleet, and by the way, I'm not criticizing the French. We'll talk more about the French in a bit because they come into the story at the end of the summer. The French fleet arrived, failing to capture the British at sea or to attack Cornwallis as he's leaving, but the French now can keep the British bottled up in New York. Okay, and what Howe is taking, Admiral Howe expects now, Washington has the French fleet here. What he is going to do is attack New York. And Washington, in fact, now is occupying, again, New Jersey and the forts along the Hudson River to keep the British from connecting again with Canada, also to keep open the lines of communication with New England. And Howe expects now Washington and the French are going to attack New York, which means if you're Howe, the admiral, or Clinton, the general, what you have to do is protect New York. Although Clinton also thinks Washington is probably too shrewd to attack New York again. What Washington is going to want to do is attack the British at a place where they are a little weaker. And that place, Clinton thinks, would be Newport in Rhode Island. Newport has a terrific harbor. It faces south, and it does have access to the interior. It's a good interior that can supply Newport. And this is where the British fleet has been. And so Clinton thinks, if I were Washington, I would now try to use the French to attack the British who are in Newport. And the town of Newport, has anyone, by the way, from Newport, been to Newport? See, I don't want to tell you things if you already know them. No one admits that they've ever heard of Newport in Rhode Island.
Yeah,
I've
I've
been
been.
there.
Yeah, I've been. I just
Oh,
not
okay.
from there.
Okay, not from there, but you've been there. Okay. Can you tell us anything about it, Jordan?
Historically, not really. Except
than
they have the mansions there.
they do have
That's the
mansions there.
most.
The mansions are a little later. Okay. And Lisette, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. It's like,
Yeah.
I've been on walking around and see like the huge mansions.
Yeah. Mansions are a little later, and I think they're mainly on the western side of the island, whereas the town and the port are on the eastern side. And by the way, Jake, you were going to say more about Newport?
No, I don't know much. I've just been there. My brother went to school at Salve Regina, so like we went over there. and hung
Okay.
sometime.
Yeah, it's a nice school.
It's a nice place. Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. Okay, so let me see if I can sketch something for you. Okay, here is something just to keep in mind. Periodically, a comedian who is struggling will say, Rhode Island. It's not a road, it's not an island, but actually it is. Newport sits on what the native people called a quidnick, but which the colonists called Rhode Island. And this is it. And this is where Newport is, at the mouth of Narragansett Bay. And up here is Portsmouth. So great location, nice big commodious harbor. In fact, there still is a naval base here in Newport. And the British have much of their fleet in Newport. And further up the bay is Providence. By the way, Providence and Newport are kind of separate places. Anyway, Providence Plantations was the name of the settlement of Providence. Newport was a little bit different, but suffice it to say, this is a very important port. Okay. Now, here is the idea that the Americans have, because now they do have a French fleet. For the first time, they have a naval force. And Washington sends General Sullivan to take command of the forces here in Newport. And militia forces come from Massachusetts, and from Connecticut, as well as from Rhode Island. And now also you have French forces. The British are here on this island, and they have their fleet here. And now you have a French fleet coming to make mischief here, join up with the Americans. And this is going to be the first joint American-French campaign of the war to dislodge the British from Newport. And this is toward the end of the summer of 1778. So great opportunity. It's just, 6 months after the king has recognized American independence. And now you have a French fleet under the Comte d'Estaing to help the Americans in this cause. And it turned out to be a disaster, partly because of weather. There's a hurricane that blows up, and it actually does hit this area. And this is in an era before hurricanes were named or even very well understood. So unlike today, they didn't have weeks of weather forecasters telling us that the end of the world is approaching because there is going to be a hurricane. But you have this hurricane approaching, and let's see. Fort Adams, Ainsley asks about, was it established then or a little later? And the short answer is, and this is an answer you'll very rarely hear me give, is I don't know. I will leave that to someone else to find out when Fort Adams was built. I would be really surprised if there weren't a fort there earlier, probably named Fort Adams a bit later. And I would ask Ainsley to draw on the map where Fort Adams is. But yeah, there are concerts there. In fact, that's where the Newport Jazz Festival started. Sorry, I should have mentioned that since we were having next time we'll do all music. And we'll have the Newport Jazz Festival, which is a real innovation. And then of course the Newport Folk Festival. And boy, now I'm really getting off the subject here of this summer campaign much different in 1778 when this hurricane blows up. And what happens during a hurricane is both the British and the French fleet, which had been preparing to fight each other, take out to sea because each one wants to avoid getting battered in the hurricane. And both are heavily damaged in the hurricane. And the soldiers, both on Portsmouth and on Rhode Island, are really battered. The tents are blown away. The soldiers are all soaking wet. Their powder is all wet. And the British don't really have anywhere to go. But on the other hand, there's no one who can dislodge them. Poor Sullivan and his men are soaked. And the French who had come to relieve them don't come back. In fact, d'Estaing takes his fleet up to Boston to repair. And Sullivan says, well, why did he do that? Why didn't he bring his fleet to Providence to repair? This should give us some indication of John Sullivan as a military strategist, because if you have a fleet and you want to repair it, you're probably not going to repair it here where the enemy fleet can simply blockade it. Boston, much safer place for the French fleet to go to repair. So the French fleet goes off to Boston, and Sullivan is really, really angry at this. And in fact, in his general orders, he writes something to the effect of, for the first time, we have been working with our ally who's proved to be not a very good ally. It's not a good thing to say to someone who's just sent a fleet across the ocean to help you out, that you think they should have done something differently. So this is the state of things here in 1778. The French take their fleet to Boston to repair, and General Sullivan then insults the French by saying they are inept, cowardly. They didn't want to fight the English. Instead, they just worry about saving their precious ships. And so Washington does have to get General Sullivan to apologize and rescind his general orders where he insulted the French. But needless to say, the first Franco-American expedition does not go as planned. Something, of course, the British notice. Just another story while we're at it. You might notice if you're ever in front of King's Chapel that there is a small marker in stone to, has anyone seen this, by the way, marker in front of King's Chapel just to the left of the door? See, if we were in the classroom at this point, we would be leaving the classroom to go see this marker, which is one of my favorite historical markers. Yes, Lisette, you've seen it?
I've seen it.
Yes. Can you tell us anything more than that it exists? Or at least it did the last time you saw it?
I don't think I remember anything about it, but I'm pretty sure I remember seeing
Okay. It's on green slate and it is in French. And it is a monument to the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur. And the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur was a very close friend of King Louis XVI. He was a chamberlain to the king's brother, the Comte d'Artois. And he had been sent by the king kind of to be the king's eyes and ears on this whole expedition. And so the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur was part of this expedition, which had gone initially to Newport and now finds itself in Boston being repaired. And the summer of 1778, there was a bread shortage in Boston. And one reason there was a bread shortage was New England was sending most of its grain to supply the Continental Army, which meant that there wasn't a whole lot of grain to spare. And this meant the price of bread goes up astronomically. And now you have the French fleet in Boston, and the French ships are being repaired, and the French bakers have brought their ovens off of the ships and are on the docks of Boston making bread. And the smell of this delicious French bread wafts over the town of Boston. Here are people who haven't been able to buy bread. Suddenly there is this great bread being produced on the docks. And so Bostonians go down to the docks to try to get some of the bread, and the French bakers will not give them any bread. And of course, these Bostonians get quite angry at the fact that the French bakers are not supplying them with this bread. Instead, they're going to take it back aboard the ships. And can anyone predict what is going to happen when you have a mob of hungry Bostonians who want bread and a group of French bakers who will not provide them with bread? Will the Bostonians say, the French are our allies, they need all of this bread, we are grateful for that to them for coming here to help us win the war, and so we will not begrudge them this delicious French bread? Ainsley, you seem to be shaking your head at that possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what happened, but I don't think that it was that.
No, it wasn't. In fact, the Bostonians start attacking the French bakers and try to seize the bread. And what happens is the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur, the king's eyes and ears, a friend of the king, tries to step between these Bostonians and the bakers, and he is killed by this mob. And I am told, and this is, by the way, would be a good story for someone to research, I am told that the fight is broken up by soldiers from Burgoyne's army who are in town on parole. So you have a fight between the Americans and the French, who are allies in the war, being broken up by these British guys who are prisoners of war. But meanwhile, here is the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur lying dead. And that is really a bad thing. You've killed one of the king's friends. And at this point, King Louis XVI does have a lot of friends. And if he sends over his friends and his allies kill the friend, he's probably not going to send over many more of his friends or his soldiers. So this is a big problem for Boston, for America in general. The death of the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur. And I fear I'm getting way off of the subject, but this is a story too good to not tell you, so that you will, yes, this will be on the exam. What happens to the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur? The province of Massachusetts votes $5,000 to build a monument to the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur. And they have the Comte d'Estaing write a tribute to him. And also they agree that he can have a funeral mass. This may be the first public mass, legal mass celebrated in Boston. It's a Catholic mass, and he is buried in King's Chapel. King's Chapel had been an Anglican church. Most of the Anglicans had left in 1776. There are still a few. They actually cut out of the prayer book the prayers to the king. But other than that, they're continuing. But now they have a Catholic mass, bury the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur, and with all of the rites of the church. And then they have the Comte d'Estaing write this tribute, which will be inscribed on this $5,000 monument. They write all of this to the king so that he will know that forever after, all citizens of Boston and all visitors to Boston will see the valor of the Comte d'Estaing and will remember the valor of the Comte d'Estaing, great friend to America. By the way, the inscription is all in French, so I am kind of paraphrasing it roughly. There's a wonderful tribute to the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur there in front of King's Chapel. And so in about 1910 or so, so all was somewhat forgiven. And we'll get later on, we'll get to how another French army comes to America with a better result. The Comte d'Estaing, for his part, after repairing his fleet, takes it to the West Indies, which is much more important to both the French and the British. But meanwhile, here in Boston, we have dodged a bullet. Unfortunately, the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur was not so lucky. And however, in about 1910 or so, a man in Paris who is really interested in American history is reading about the Revolution, and he reads about this monument in Boston to the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur. And he writes to a friend of his in Boston saying, when I come to Boston, I really insist that you show me the monument to the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur. It sounds like quite a remarkable thing. And his friend in Boston says, yeah, that does sound like a really remarkable thing, because the Bostonians had never actually gotten around to putting it up. You know, you write to the king saying, we're putting up this great monument. How likely is it he is going to ever come looking for it? So it's really, for Boston, the best of both worlds. We get the king thinking we put up this monument, and we don't actually have to put it up. But now suddenly there is someone coming to look for it. And this is, of course, well, the monument which you can see was actually put up in 1916. And I'm told that the cement was still wet when the French consul came to the dedication of it in 1916. At a time, of course, when there's another war going on, and this time the English and the French and the Americans will all be on the same side. And so there you have it, the monument to the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur, whose valor will never be forgotten. Okay, now where were we? Well, Washington is not able to get the British out of Newport, but he is able to keep them pinned down in Newport as well as in New York. And Clinton, recognizing that Washington really does have, they've held Philadelphia, couldn't keep it. They hold Newport, can't really go anywhere else. Clinton says, remember, Clinton had thought, why don't we just give up on everything between Florida and Canada and let them fight it out? He says, well, why don't we connect again with the Carolinas? And so Clinton does send a force to Georgia and to South Carolina later in the year of 1778, early 1779. But meanwhile, the entrance of France into the war, and neither the French nor the English are going to spend a lot of time fighting each other in North America. There are lots of other places they can fight, like the West Indies, which is why d'Estaing's fleet goes to the West Indies, and also like England itself. Britain now has to worry about a French invasion of Britain. And in fact, in 1779, Spain enters the war, not because Spain thinks it would be a great thing to have the United States independent, but because Spain sees that the English, British, and the French are fighting, and this would be a good opportunity for Spain to attack Gibraltar, which Spain wants to do. And France also convinces Spain that a good thing for both of them to do would be to invade England. And meanwhile, the French also are sponsoring American warships, which can be now built in France because France is now at war with England. And so France is building ships, and one of them is given to John Paul Jones, who is a deserter from the British Navy, who uses his ship, the Bonhomme Richard, to attack the ports of Ireland, of Scotland, and the north of England. So now the Americans and their French allies are able to carry the war into England, which of course is going to change the dynamic of the war. England now has to worry not only about protecting the home islands, but also about protecting English trade in the English Channel and in the North Sea. And it is these raids of Jones and others. In 1778, Jones had captured a British warship off the coast of England. That is, you're able now to wage war on England in and around England, which really does change the nature of the war. So in the summer of 1779, Jones attacks a British convoy off the coast of England. One thing the English do is now start using convoys, and he engages the British ship protecting the convoy, the Serapis, and both ships are destroyed. This is, of course, the great moment when Jones's ship is sinking, and the British captain asks him if he wants to surrender. And what is it Jones says when the British captain asks if he is going to surrender his sinking vessel, his burning vessel, which is now sinking? What are the immortal words of John Paul Jones standing on the deck of the burning Bonhomme Richard?
I have not yet begun to fight.
Thank you, Jake. I have not yet begun to fight. Thank you. Wow. You see, sometimes I think I shouldn't just tell all of these old chestnuts because you've probably heard them before. And it's a little disappointing, but all B, somewhat reassuring that this is all still fresh to someone. Or was that such an obvious one no one else wanted to answer? Thank you, Jake. Well, with that, I think we'll call it a night. Any questions? Okay, well, I will see you all on Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Take care.